I think it's clear that the housing market is stuck. The definition of insanity is to keep repeating the same outcome, the same task and expecting a different outcome. And I think we're at risk. We really need to make a step change in how we deal with housing and how we deal with our cities. So the solution, I think, requires some sort of symbiosis between local authorities or wider than that, actually, the people involved in planning our cities. And Toby mentioned about that, getting that connection between the infrastructure and the housing and all these different policies. So I don't know who I was suggesting was the crocodile in this situation, but developers and designers do need to play a big role in this. I mentioned designers specifically because I think design has a huge role to play in unlocking this and in coming up with innovative ways to solve the housing problem. So at the moment we have these urban planning targets imposed, set by Westminster. We've got to build these houses, we all know that. We have local authorities that have got this huge problem. Where do we put these houses? How do we deal with this? So we have these, we seem to be trying to make spread this risk, spread this housing allocation between different places. So in essence, we run the risk of making our towns, making this sprawl become a little bit, all villages and towns that have a character becoming a little bit fatter. My vote is for the first, and I agree that there's no one single answer, but firstly to try and increase the density of our cities. Our cities aren't that dense. There's a whole range of different densities when you benchmark, but in Western Europe our cities aren't that dense. There's a big scope to increase the density, and I think that's got to be where we start. The pressure on Greenbelt already been spoken about, and I think to make that the last sort of the last tack that we would come to in the choice of options would make sense for me. The risk with some of these villages and towns are actually the reason people want to live in these character villages is because of the great identity that they have, the character, the communities that build up in these places. They're based around village greens and amenities that are built for the size of those villages. When we stretch that out, the character changes and the social dynamics of those places change. So people no longer walk to the local pub or to the local shop. They're having to drive, and then do I drive to the shop? Do I just go to Tesco's? It's much easier. So you end up with all these other social changes that are rather complex and difficult. We've got this over-reliance on cars as well. Infrastructure, as I mentioned before, a really key component of ingredients of making our cities work. One really interesting statistic that I think I just want to mention here, which is a really key part of the solution to housing, is that the Future Homes Commission did a survey last year that said that 75% of the UK population would not buy a new build home. Now, that's not because they are all DIY fanatics or they like spending a little bit more money on drafty homes. It's because it just doesn't appeal to them. We have a standard type of new build home. This is a generalisation here, but we tend to have standard models, and they're not always specifically designed for locations. They're not orientated. They're not always taking into account amenities. So I think that puts a lot of people off. It's inspiration, really. People want to be inspired, and I think a lot of looking at that 75% statistic, which I find in one way quite shocking, but in another way you can sort of see it. But I've completely forgotten my thread here. I was going to say that. I'll move on. Innovation, it was mentioned before. We don't innovate in housing. And I use this analogy of the 1990s Nokia. We all had one of these, or anybody over sort of 25 had one of these phones, and Nokia held this whole market share, and their idea of innovation was to change the colours on these phones. And you have no market share anymore. They didn't innovate, and I think there's a parallel with housing. We really are not innovating. We're taking the same way of construction, the same models, and we're playing with those front covers of the houses. Another big factor is, and sorry, I'll just take a little step back there. We keep talking about this housing crisis, but as well as the housing crisis, we have a climate crisis. We have an environmental sustainability issue to deal with. One sort of elephant in the room, which seems to not get as much attention as it should, is there's a huge design gap. And what I mean by that is the gap between what architects are designing properties at and how they're actually performing in practice. And this is a big problem as well if we're to address the environmental costs and associations with housing. We are going to be building, going back to the question of where our grandchildren will live, we are going to be building a lot of these new homes, and to build them in the right way and address the climate issues is really key. About a third of our country's energy goes into homes, so it's a large portion. So back to that question, where are we going to live? I think that the first thing to say is this is a huge opportunity. We're at a moment in time here, and looking at some of those statistics and graphs about, but we're just emerging from a recession. There's been a slow in the growth of, there was a rush, a frenzy to build a lot of very poor quality homes in as the market economies dictated that was a prime time to sell. But we've got a huge opportunity for our cities to really challenge convention, to get on the front foot, and to be very visionary about how we can accommodate this extra housing requirement. And that, going back to that, the requirement to get infrastructure and the amenities as well as the housing numbers, it's one big jigsaw that all needs knitting together. It does need vision, and this is an image of Freiburg, which the Academy of Urbanism I think they spoke, a chap from Freiburg at one of the 4x4s a few years ago. But having that vision that is really strong, and that developers and people, the communities can actually galvanise their thoughts and create a place that someone mentioned earlier that our grandchildren will actually be proud of. I think that's really cool. There's an opportunity also for new companies to disrupt the market. Using that phone analogy again, we aren't innovating, and I think that's a really important thing. Customers, customers, not from a developer point of view, but customers and people are actually looking for inspirational design. They're looking for something different. I think that 75% of the people that wouldn't buy a new build home are actually buying period properties. They're changing those, they're adapting them to how they put in their own stamp on them. But we've stopped building period homes. There's a lot of mention about design, about shared surfaces, about putting people first, giving priorities to people and cyclists rather than cars. I'm a real advocate of building higher density. That doesn't mean that has to come at the expense of having private space or amenities. We can build higher density, we can provide people with better places to live. The sustainability, this is a development that we're actually doing, so it's timber frame housing. So we're dealing with that design gap by really detailing out some of these challenges that cause some of the sustainable problems and weaknesses in our housing stock. And we can do that. It requires R&D, it requires innovation, it requires investment, but it's imminently doable. There's lots of exemplars that are across Europe, and I think sometimes we can be a little bit talking about before about risk averse and the reasons for that, reasons for developers being risk averse, but taking a leap of faith and out of the comfort zone, I think will give big results. Testing, so back to the design gap again, but testing of actually how properties are performing, not how we think they might be performing. So that sustainability, again, key. Taking risks. Developers as a rule, we're talking about the land acquisition there. Toby was talking about the land acquisition is the risky bit. The rest of it is not risky, but so we're really as an industry, and I think there's other parts of that comes into funding, that we're reliant on funders who will appoint valuers, who will need precedents, who will look at what happened yesterday, and that really stifles what developers are feeling comfortable doing. So getting somebody to put a value on anything new or bold is challenging. So what are we doing about it? I'm waxing lyrical about all the problems. I just wanted to make a few slides. We're a small developer, so we're only making a very tiny little impact on a small part of this country. But I think following some of the exemplars of inspirational schemes around the world can really make a difference, and it's that influence of that I was talking about with valuers and the whole industry being able to point to precedents that have happened before. So this is a building that is in Leeds that we bought from the local authority, actually, which I'm sure a lot of you in the room will know very well. But dealing with our housing crisis, this is a classic example of something that had market failure. It was an existing building in an area that people didn't want to live. This is what people are telling us. People that didn't want to live. Building was uncommercial, could not be converted. The economics didn't work. To do a sustainable building would never work. The costs would be too big. The risk associated with doing conversions is too complex. So you take that on paper, and that would be a site that would never happen. But we actually developed this through the recession, right at the bottom of that graph that Toby showed up. We developed that through 2008 to 2010. There's 172 apartments here. It's a very sustainable building. It's a mix of different uses, so it's a way of accommodating housing numbers in a building that was previously scheduled for demolition. We've got another site that we bought in Sheffield. This is a former steelworks, brownfield land, heart of a city. We're actually building out of timber. We're making passive houses. Again, a mixed-use community. We've got leisure, we've got working, we've got homes in the city, family homes. There's talk about families moving out of Greater Manchester and the transient population moving in, but we don't have that stock to cater for the demographic of families and different age groups in the city. So this is something that is really key if we're to change the demographic and dynamic of our cities to make them inclusive. Another important bit about homes of the future is about embracing technology. So that has a big role to play. Again, this isn't commonplace. We don't do a lot of R&D. We don't do a lot of innovation, but we can actually we control and monitor a lot of our homes, what our homes are doing, heating them when they need to be heated, providing hot water when that's needed, and really understanding how our homes are how our homes are consuming energy, and with that information we can then do something about it to try and mitigate it. Finally, we've got a number of new schemes that we are looking at, we've purchased, we're on with. There's 3 new ones in Leeds. These, again, looking at the overall housing numbers, we're not going to make any significant impact into that, but we are going to keep to those principles of building on brownfield, inner city, urban, well-connected, sustainable, well-designed properties, and that's essentially our mantra. Thank you.
Good.